Welcome, everyone. It is pleasant to see you. And thank you for making the time, obviously. Um, so, as I've already briefed the audience, that this is, even despite the title having apocalypse in it, this is going to be a panel for hope. So, looking at all your profiles, there's something quite interesting that particularly struck me about where we would try and place the apocalypse. Because when we talk about the apocalypse, there's always, I believe, it would hold a different notion, it would hold a different meaning in time and space for not just the panel, but for each and every one of you out in the audience. So to perhaps lend or render, I would say, a few more vivid perceptions of the apocalypse, can I start with you, Vishal, on where perhaps would you place an apocalypse temporally speaking?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming over on a Sunday morning. It's almost that.
It's to put you in the heat of the moment,
Yeah,
apocalypse.
Marilyn Monroe,
Yeah.
happy birthday, Mr. President, kind of a
Yes.
moment, right? um, mm, in the past, definitely in the past, for me, to start with as a conversation. And one of the things that it ties into even the festival, because we're talking about cinema, architecture, image. What's interesting to me is to bring back, let's say, an exhibition, a seminal exhibition from the 1970s by Bernard Rudowski at the MoMA called Architecture Without Architects. And what was most interesting about this exhibition was that this exhibition is all about pictures. It doesn't have models, it doesn't have drawings for a very specific reason, because it's architecture without architects. And I kind of like that idea that, a whole imagination is opened up. And we are talking about as modernism has already happened, which according to me, to a certain degree, is apocalyptic in its own self. So for me, the temporality of it is definitely in the past, never in the future. The imaginations are of the future, but the apocalypse has happened, is where I start with. Yeah.
It's quite interesting because, I mean, it's especially, and I'm going to come back to this later, especially the kind of media that we consume shapes the certain visual that you just mentioned of the apocalypse. However, it is quite prescient of us to realize that we might just be living one, or it has happened multiple times in the past, and also that it perhaps may not be limited to a certain period in time or a moment in time. It may just be quite present continuous. Nuru, your work, I think, straddles between something that's quite, unreal in the most literal sense, and something that finds its grounding, I feel. How would you respond to placing something of an apocalyptic nature in architecture in a certain time period? What would you define as our temporal perceptions of an apocalypse?
Yeah, so, I just want to see this, through this intersection of architecture, the apocalypse, and cinema, because I think we all here because for a love for films and the sort of strong connection between architecture and cinema. And just sort of think of this as three nodes. There's architecture, there's the apocalypse, and cinema. And I first just wanted to talk about the relationship between architecture and cinema. As I said, that's why we're here, right? And of course, it's very multidisciplinary. There could be a great sense of fertilization or cross-pollination between these two sort of disciplines. And I can't help but go back to this tutor at the A. I don't know if you've probably heard of him. You studied there as well, Pascal Schoening. And Pascal was actually heading a unit in the diploma course. And he actually championed this idea of architectural films, right? So his students were not working, were not drafting, were not using rotring pens or pencils, they were not cutting sections, plans, elevations, making models, but they were actually creating films to manifest this architectural idea. And he also brought into the concept of atmospheres. So, how does sort of light streak through smoke or fog, and then during different times of the day, and how does it sort of kiss, the monolithic nature of architecture. So he brought in these fascinating ideas. And for me, when you then look at the second sort of relationship, which is between architecture, cinema, and the apocalypse, for me, cinema has been a very strong influence in sort of understanding and visualizing what is an apocalypse, right? So a lot of these have been sort of manifested through ruins and decay. And there's also this whole sense of fortress building. You know, you sort of see that people start to build walls and fortresses and huddle together. And also there have been sort of like a metaphor of a garden within a ruin, or a biome, a green biome within desertification. Now, one great sort of experience that I've had watching like the Snowpiercer, I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah.
It's an incredible movie, but for me what struck me the most was that the fortress was mobile, right? It's a train, it's not a static sort of citadel during medieval times, but it's a train. But it's also about the stratification of society, right? So when we talk about the apocalypse, we're talking about hope and building resilience, but it's also then looking at a very dystopian future or a dystopian past where you could have oppression, you could have this really strong sort of division between the working class and the bourgeois, so to speak. And the Snowpiercer does it very well because it's not a traditional pyramid structure, but it's more like a linear sort of sausage, and you see the working class right at the back end, and it is a symbiotic / parasitic relationship. So for me, these were very important sort of references, or like Mad Max and great sort of movies that talk about resilience, but in that narrative, fuel and water become the two most important elements. And they've said, wars of the future would be fought for water, not for oil, or perhaps now for data. But this is just a sort of a quick preamble that I wanted to talk about.
That's absolutely, sort of marvelous that you brought a few film references into this, because we are, after all, a film festival. The way that you talk about a sort of segregation in society, but that manifesting in a linear manner in Snowpiercer, there's a similar film, it's a Netflix film, not too fancy, but it's called The Platform. And it divides social strata in a very vertical manner. So there's a platform, it's a jail, there's a platform full of food, and the people with the least intense sentences, they're at the top. So they get to feast on the whole table, and the table passes down, and the people at the bottom get the remains. And that is quite stringently set in the future. So I think that's a wonderful segue for me to get into gauging a response from you, Samira. I think what Nuru mentioned about societal differences manifesting in architecture could be a great cue for understanding how you place an apocalypse temporally. Of course, that's the key question, but how would you imagine something like that perhaps shaping your current practice?
Wow. I'd like to respond to two things. One, to the question that you asked, of course, and then maybe take a cue from where Nuru brings in this whole idea
Absolutely.
of films, because I've been, I'm a great film buff, and I truly, truly believe in the idea, the cinematic idea of filmmaking being very closely associated with the way we process architecture or the making of buildings. And I, for one, actually follow and write out scripts. So I'll go back to the first question where you're saying, where would you place the apocalypse? And I don't want to be negative or a pessimist.
Absolutely.
But I also want to be as honest as I need to be, and I think it's now. I think if I look at the cities, especially in India and maybe in the developing countries, I think there's a huge sort of state of flux that's happening and we're witnessing. And it's in a sense now, because I feel, well, what does an apocalypse mean? It's the end, right? It's the end of humanity. And so I will only think of it metaphorically, because the apocalypse is actually predicted probably 1 million years from now. And so it's too early, but if we start early, then we are ready, right? So I will talk about it metaphorically, and I feel that when I go through the streets of Mumbai, and I know Mumbai well, or the best, because I've been brought up here, I feel it's in a complete state of shambles. And even though we know what's the right thing to do, even though we talk about environments, even though we talk about green spaces, even though we talk about mental health, even though we talk about well-being, it's all lip service. So I feel it's now, and I think it's about time that we literally take this very seriously to say, how do we set this right? So that, I mean, I'm sure the discussion will go on further there, so I would stop to take this answer further on that side. And to take a cue from what Nuru has begun to talk about cinema and architecture, I feel cinema is extremely powerful. I mean, the fact that there's always it has the power of catharsis with the audience, so there's, you know, a direct emotional connect and a huge takeaway. I think the impact in communicating messages that film has, perhaps art also in a very, very subtle way, and now the emerging contemporary art is doing that extremely well. I think these are very powerful media. And I feel architecture, I truly believe, also has that power. It's how you decide to take it upon yourself to say, I will build with certain principles, I will build to create a response, and I will build to give a message. And what that message is, I don't mean like a moral message or something like that, but just the experience of it that can change the way you think or change your life. So I'd leave it at that.
That's quite powerful, and also, well, opportune for me to segue into you, Dar. The kind of symbolic society that Samira mentioned, and I think quite provocatively, but also quite urgently, is to be believed as something that's present. So I do align with Samira on that viewpoint, that we continue to perceive an apocalypse in the present so as to plan better for the future, right? However, media shapes perceptions, as all of us know, and all of us have already pointed out. I want to take this up with you, Dar, about you being a filmmaker. How would you say a representation of a particular cityscape would render or place the apocalypse in a certain time period, especially when you look at it from the cinematic lens and behind it, of course?
I think before answering that question, I just want to share my feelings. When I got an email about, about the panel discussion, my main fear was, I knew that you were my panelists and we'll be having a discussion, and my main fear was that everyone will be like so calm and so organized. It's like beautiful buildings, beautiful architectural structures, super organized with a very clear plan, and then me, which is like that. It's just like labyrinth. It's like here you have Minotaur, magical creature, mythological, monster, and here there's a dead end, right? So this is how I feel during this discussion. And especially when we talk about apocalypses, right? Because it's exciting and at the same time scary. It's like film set. When you come on the film set, it's like apocalypse. You don't know where it will go. You don't know how to create any kind of cosmos out of the chaos. But what's interesting for me is just definition of apocalypse. Because as we remember, it comes from New Testament, and it was just name of the book, right? Name of the book that was describing the future events. So the meaning, which comes from Greek word, apocalypse was not the old end or scary events. It was revelation or new knowledge that is coming. And I think the idea of new knowledge that right now all of us who are experiencing in our professions, we were just discussing backstage AI, right? That's just entering my industry. And now most of the agencies or clients, they come to me and they're saying, we don't need you, we just have AI. And you're like, is this the end of my profession? But then you realize it's not exactly the end. It's new knowledge, it's new revelation. And I think what's incredible thing about apocalypse is that we are being defined by the way how we will adapt to it. We can look at it as the end. We can look at it as the hope, because of course more and we feel, more hope will arise, right? So I think the idea of definition of how I look at my profession, how I can adapt my fears and my desires and this new reality that's being built, this is what's fascinating for me. Will I be strong enough, or I will be just nihilistic? I think like all of us as creators who have this feeling of, like all of us, we are teenagers, different age, 11, 12, 15, 18. And teenagers, they have excitement to create, but also nihilism of none of this matters, and that's whatever I will create will make sense. And this is what I think exciting. And when it comes down to looking at films and architecture, when you said such a beautiful thing that when you build something, when you create the plan, you write the script. So when I think about my scripts, I look at it as a building. When it has connection, sometimes it has dead end, and sometimes I can't find that connection between washroom and bedroom. You know, there is no connection to that. And it just goes months and months trying to figure out the beautiful plan. So I think the labyrinth of our thoughts and our connection to what will be next and how we will reveal ourselves in that next.
It's quite exciting to hear. We have filmmakers doubling up as architects and architects doubling up as filmmakers. So that's an interesting switch. But something that you said really stuck with me in the sense of thinking about hope stemming from perhaps a nihilistic thought, which is that we can see the apocalypse as perhaps not the end of times, but as the beginning of a new one, maybe. However, something that you said about, being in the director's chair, sort of managing everything while there's chaos all around you. With respect to all your answers about placing the apocalypse in a certain time period, I want to ask about, or I want to gauge actually, about the agency of the creative professional within this apocalypse. Whether they get to define it, whether they get to be citizens of it, whether they get to be witnesses of it. So Vishal, I'll start with you because you did bring up one of my favorite reads from when I was at the AA, Architecture Without Architects. Where do you think is the architect in the apocalypse? Or, let's simplify it a bit, is there an architect in the apocalypse?
I mean, more and more, I'm thinking the irrelevance of architects because so much has changed in the world. And as we had discussed once, that for me, the world wars changed everything. The landscape of the globe changed because of the world wars. And I think that the profession actually started taking a turn around that time. And today what we are looking at, and it's also the reason why one constantly thinks of, okay, cinema references, let's look at The Matrix. Okay. And then when the revelation comes that Zion has been destroyed 6 times, and you are not the only one. There have been many neos and things like that, So it's cyclical. And what is interesting about architecture in relation to, let's say, the apocalypse, view through the lens of cinema, is interesting for me only for one reason, is because we are always waiting for the apocalypse to happen, so we know that the end is coming, which means that we have to have a grand spectacle. I mean, what's the point in going out with a whimper? So buildings have to topple and things have to get flooded. It's actually built into the mythology. Yeah. Now, where is the role of architects there? I don't know, but the role of poets is very important. I mean, I've always felt that poets are important to society. Every other profession can take a back seat. So, when you, like for example, Kaifi Azmi's great Maqtal-e Beirut, which is Murder of Beirut, which he wrote right about the time when the Lebanon War in 1980, 82 happened, 82. And there are 2 lines which say that, they're very famous, right? I mean, Kab uthayega khuda hashr khuda hi jane. Aadmi roz koi naya hashr utha deta hai. Naya nahi. Aadmi roz hashr utha deta. Now, hashr is a very interesting word within Urdu, because it is doomsday, it's revelation, it's all of those, sarvanash. When we talk about the apocalypse is an ongoing phenomenon. I mean, it's a build-up to something which we never see. And I think that that's why I keep going back to the wars and architecture without architects, because the reason why that exhibition became very important for me, particularly for me, is that the profession has existed without architects, and it will continue to exist without architects. This apocalyptic thing is maybe partly what we've also done, right? We want to be cinematic sometimes as architects. So in that being cinematic, we want to be grand, we want to be, and that's like a resource unfriendly way of working. Cinema can afford it because cinema is not about materiality in that sense. And now more ever, no sets are being built. So, I mean, if we are looking at the apocalypse, and there are many kinds of apocalypses, not one,
the World Wars particularly, I think, placed the mushroom at the end of the world, as
Yeah.
Anna Singh would call it,
Yeah.
as a very fixed visual on what the apocalypse might look like. It's a big bang, looks like a mushroom, and
Right.
everything is just wiped away.
Right.
And there is a grandness with the buildings toppling, and that cinema has that aspect of sort of feeding into that
Yeah,
visual
yeah.
narrative as well.
I mean, where the Godzilla thing comes in and all of
Yeah.
that. But also, to kind of quickly wrap that point up, I really enjoyed The Brutalist as a film.
Beautiful.
You know, because it goes back to why the war is important, was important. In reshaping, everything about the world changed after the World Wars. Everything changed. And we have to take, like, in a very important pivotal way, we have to acknowledge what the war did to all professional practices across the globe, and not just image. Internally, what it did, you know, this modularity, this banal, boring, eventually where we get to see the Excel sheet architecture. That's an apocalypse within architecture.
Yes,
This
yes.
Excel sheet, you know, which is running the profession. But okay, sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, Poets was definitely one of the highlights of your response, and thinking Cafe Azmi in the same talk as an apocalypse was something of an eye-opener for me. But I'm going to use that perhaps to get to you, Nuru, on seeing how would you place your practice, which I would define as a bit of a hybrid. How do you place that sort of hybrid practice in defining the role of an architect in the apocalypse?
So, I don't know what that means, hybrid,
It's a-
because we are
it's a-
sort of
yeah.
building everything that we're doing right now. Or we actually intend to build everything that we're doing. You know, I'd sort of, you know, I think there are 2 or 3 nice sort of ideas coming from this discussion. One is the idea of reboot. One is, what is the definition of a apocalypse? Is it sort of humanity, you know, at the edge of extinction? Or is it the antithesis of utopia, which is the perfect sort of world order, versus the idea of dystopia, you know, which is also about oppression? And I believe you can, it's far more, it's worse to actually have a million deaths every day in terms of that sort of dystopian futures about, you know, oppression and lack of thought. Now, coming back to the architectural bit, is one sort of architect that really struck me when I was a young student of architecture was Lebbeus Woods. I don't know if you've heard of Lebbeus Woods. But Lebbeus Woods, one of his seminal works was War and Architecture, 1993, I think. And his work was basically a manifestation, or architecture is a manifestation of societal collapse and wars and disasters, right? And for him, it was also like the war in architecture also spoke a lot about Sarajevo, what was happening to Sarajevo at that period of time, and how architecture could sort of manifest or sort of illustrate the scars on humanity and also build hope and resilience. Now, if you see Lebbeus Woods architecture, it sort of evokes a sense of the machinic, and it also evokes a sense of an organism. So it's a nice sort of blurring between the man-made and natural, but it's not, it's also about like, you know, these sort of machinic organisms moving through the city, looking for survival. And also his project, the Aerial Paris, was about these floating, you know, architectural monuments above the city of Paris. And he also had interesting 1990, the Berlin Free Zone, which is also talking about, you know, sort of moving beyond political boundaries, right? And looking for an architecture that is more fragmented and nomadic. So for me, what becomes interesting is that this is becoming an entire cycle. You know, we spoke about citadels, we spoke about medieval periods, we spoke about, you know, just rebooting. How does humanity reboot itself? How does nature reboot itself? And it is a sort of, it is a great opportunity, but it's also a system which could be, could lead to oppression. The mighty could sort of govern the weak. And there have been many, many fascinating examples, both in architectural theories through Lebbeus Woods' work and and even through cinema. So it becomes very, very interesting. You know.
Lippeswood's manifesto, Architecture is War, I think stood out quite starkly in terms of the other modernist manifestos that were being produced at that time. So I think your response, aligning with that sort of, I mean, a lot of people would see hope in a manifesto that is titled Architecture is War, and that one that stands out from all the hope that modernism seemed to be bringing out for architects. So in that sense, I think it's a very, very prescient response, very omnipresent, even to whatever architectural age or ism comes after what we're experiencing right now. Now moving to you, Samira, I have a sort of a very present provocation for you. We've seen what's going on right now in LA with the wildfires spreading, and you know, when you see the kind of destruction that's brought upon both the natural and the built landscape, we come to think of perhaps architecture in terms of longevity. What stays, what doesn't stay, what gets completely wiped away, what gets burned out, what gets turned to ashes. How do you think that sort of understanding of architecture as just completely temporary, perhaps, and not permanent? How would you say, or would you say that seeps into your practice, your designs, the way that you would think about a building as something that perhaps may be struck down by a disaster tomorrow?
Well, it's not something that I've thought of often, but well, we're always taught to think of architecture as being timeless, and that to build concepts that are timeless, and that generations after generations would be able to enjoy the building, perhaps adapt it differently, but definitely enjoy it and engage with it. So that's not something that I've thought of often, but I think I see your point, and the one thing that I've always advocated and now for quite some time is the idea of recycling. And therefore, I feel, you know, the more and more that you read about life and, you know, explore ideas about, you know, existential ideas about life in general, then there is this kind of, well, I wouldn't say enlightenment, but a kind of understanding that life goes on, but we're in a finite world. We're in a finite world of resources. And it's the same matter that gets reproduced. I mean, even if you look at Hindu philosophy, it's like you are reincarnating life. That means I'm just wondering, are there therefore finite souls that just get reincarnated? Which means there is a sense of the finite, which in itself is infinite in a sense. But that means that you've got to reuse and you've got to recycle. So if I have to look at buildings that therefore are temporal in nature, then I would look at material that is not necessarily something that stays forever in a particular shape, but can adapt. So you can dismantle it and, you know, bring it back again. And therefore the loss is not a huge one in a sense. So that's one way I would think of it, and a lot of the work that we do does trying to think of that. On the other hand, buildings that literally last long with materials that are time tested, and we know that for a fact now when you see buildings of stone that have lasted, if you look at Egypt, and I mention it because I've just come back from it and so it's kind of fresh, these buildings they claim are 4,000 years old, and there's been a finding that's very recent as of a week back. So, and there must have been some kind of apocalypse there for an entire civilization to be completely drowned under the sands. So in some sense, I feel that it's the material, this choice of material that you make, understanding its construction techniques, and both sensual and metaphysical sort of experiences with that material and how it kind of resonates, makes you feel, that's important. And that choice of material will decide, you know, how long the building lasts. Having said that, I think technology is moving so fast that if I know something today, tomorrow I have to learn something new. You know, it's like I'm still struggling with. I have one system. I think Umberto Eco also had this problem, and he said, you know, I'm just beginning to learn one software on the computer, and I've been asked to deal with another one. So how do I cope with this? And it's like sometimes I feel I'm just coping with new systems, but where is the sense of music? I have great new music systems, but am I allowed to make new music? I need time. I need peace. I need to be slow for that. I need blankness. And that is what I miss. So in some sense, that's the apocalypse, like Vishal mentioned. To sort of take on from where he is, I in some sense disagree that we don't need architects. I think all of us are losing the responsibility. I think we don't have the responsibility to be, a doctor is responsible, but we architects take our profession fairly lightly, casually. We feel it's okay to not know many things that an architect should know before he builds. I think you should know construction. I think you should have experience about the latest materials available. I think you have to know technology, and the way technology is moving, it's so fast. It's kind of very difficult to cope. And then now you have a generation because of digital media where everybody knows everything, and you have people walking up to you saying, "I know it better than you." Mm-hmm. So that becomes another challenge. Yeah. And I think it's not that architects are not needed. I think good architects are really, really badly needed. So I would.
Yeah, that's a number of provocations I feel in this one. Number one being, what particularly struck me, I think, was about there being a finite number of souls. That seems just an attractive option at this point of time. The other one being that everyone seems to be listening to the music, and that brings me back to the sort of Oppenheimer biography by Nolan, which had the winning track, basically. Can you hear the music? So that, I think, is an interesting provocation in terms of looking at creative professions that way. That brings me to you in terms of perhaps an emotional intangibility, because the rest of the panel has practiced architecture in one way or another. I would twist the question a bit for you in terms of the heart of the creative professional. Where do you think that lies in the apocalypse? Away, not perhaps away, but a little at bay with the practicalities of the profession?
It's a very painful question. I think just answering in one line, the heart is in the brain. And I will talk about it a bit later. I just want to say firstly that all the generations, we were always obsessed about apocalypse. So many books were written. So many paintings were painted. Remember an apocalypse that we were predicted in 1999, then transition to 2000 and data transitions. And we always think and maybe hope that it's the end of the world, because what's the end of the world? All my responsibilities are forgotten. I can just leave everything, leave my job, run there and just save my life, right? And just to find shelter. So this way, all of us, we are obsessed with our lives because solipsism is there. I exist, other people don't exist. And therefore, apocalypse will be, I will experience that. All of us, we're right now discussing apocalypse, even though time that we're living, maybe it's one of the best times. Yes, we have war, but war were there. Yes, we have problems, but problems also were there. Of course, where we're heading right now, we don't know. But I think the way how we will preserve what we have and plan what we have in the future, this is the key. I agree that if we look at the history, we went through very turbulent times, but the only difference is we were able to adapt and to find new tools. Nowadays, what my fear is that are we ready to build new tools to adapt to the new realities and apocalypses? I have interns coming to my office and saying, our dream is to be filmmakers and we want to be directors. And I'm like, great, amazing, come and assist. They come for 2 months and they said, I'm ready. Like, no, it just takes 8-10 years just to become director or just to understand what filmmaking is. Like, no, I'm ready. I want to create today. And to create today, just because all of us, we're obsessed with our mobile phones, with social media, of course, we keep discussing it, with very fast gratification. Today, we have so many young students sitting here in the audience, and we need just to ask ourselves, when last time we read the book, or how many books we read a month, how many books we read a year, how much are we actually challenging our brain? Because if our brain is not adapting all the time and we're using other tools to solve our problems, in the future, maybe we wouldn't be able to adapt to the new reality. And then we will have to suffer its consequences. So I think the key right now is just to look back, not just at filmmaking or at architecture, but maybe just architecture of our brain. Are we ready to take responsibility for ourselves to be able physically and mentally to create something? Can we push ourselves to do it today?
I can't think of a better close to that, honestly. The provocation with Dar's words, apparently, and it's about thinking of the apocalypse in terms of a consequence. We have all the tools that we need to perhaps bring about the apocalypse as of this moment. But do we have the tools to resile, to rebuild, perhaps to live an afterlife after the apocalypse? I think that's a rather hopeful note to end on. And,
Or unhopeful.
Or unhopeful. If we can take something away from this panel about thinking of it in terms of individual responsibility, not just of, well, panelists who have a certain degrees of accomplishment, but also young people out there in terms of thinking of the apocalypse as prescient as we have thought, thinking of it as something that has happened in the past or maybe continues to happen, and then equipping ourselves with the right knowledge and tools, as you mentioned, is in some ways subsuming a certain responsibility for not just humankind bringing about the apocalypse, but also perhaps pervading it and living an afterlife. I think that, for me, is a bit of a parable for hope, an opening into hope. And on that note, I would love to welcome some questions for the panel if you have any. Can we have somebody over there?
Hi. I completely appreciate all of the theoretical concepts that you're discussing and metaphorical and whatnot. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the ground in terms of all the redevelopment projects that Bombay is facing, and how, from my limited experience, but what I've seen is all the texture of Bombay kind of coming down, and then these giant towers where the first 8 floors are parking, and then it's gated, and then the street becomes almost like a gutter or something. Like, it's really like, how do you use your place as an architect and take responsibility for creating architecture that can help support social equality instead of reinforcing inequities to a point that is so extreme that it becomes an apocalyptic reality? Because if every building becomes this tower, then what will the street of Bombay be?
I think Samira is ready with the response.
Well, I'm sure. So is Nuru. What's your name, ma'am?
Claire.
Claire?
Yeah, Baker.
Claire, it's a question that we're asking ourselves as well. But having said that, I could sit on the fence with an answer and say that most of the buildings that are coming down have lived their lives. And it's like an old woman or an old man, on crutches, being given, is already in a state of coma, is dying, and you're still pumping it and say, okay, you got to live another few years. That's not going to work, right? So you have to do something about it. So what do? You have to rebuild. And when you rebuild, all I'm saying is, there's that policy, is there a master plan? Are we looking out for green spaces? That is lacking. And that is something that I've always been talking about or voicing, saying, where is the planning? Everything just mushrooms in this country. I'm sorry to say that, but I know that it does. And I think that a lot of these kind of sort of questions, requirements, social plague, as I may call it, is out of lack of a nationalist, environmentalist policy and planning. There's complete lack of it. Everybody does what they want. Money talks. Okay, so that's where all this is going on. And I think it's really important that whilst a lot of the buildings that are coming up are only going to be rehousing the rich, we don't, and I don't know how much real housing is happening to really accommodate the poor or the less privileged. I shouldn't call them poor, I mean the lesser privileged. And I think as city planners or as planners or urban planners, I think the government and people who are out there with the power to take decisions, to budget these kind of things, must do that with the interest of people at large. That's how it has to be done. So if there's nothing wrong with skyscrapers, if they're built correctly, if they're built to last, if they're built with an understanding that they can be taken off, because after another 200 years, maybe that will have to change again, or 100 years, that'll have to change again, and technology doesn't stop. So I personally feel that sometimes there has to be a policy on that also. How many new iPhones will you allow? And how many will be junked? So that every time there's a new a software that says update, and I have to do it, otherwise I'm lagging behind, or I can't communicate, or my systems are not compatible, oh, this is the older version. So there's constant of this going on, which at some time needs to stop also as part of policy, so that we have time to think creatively and to think about environments. I think that's what I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we've been also discussing and ideating and critically examining. And, it's also about, the build, demolish sort of trend that we're seeing across the last 2 or 3 decades. And then one just begins to think, what is the sort of carbon footprint of this build, demolish? And I was listening to, I think, a bite from Heatherwick, and he was mentioning that the construction industry is going to leave a far greater carbon footprint than even the aviation industry. And that is really, really scary. The other point I want to make very quickly is about, like you said, these tall towers coming in, and we're seeing a lot of these single sort of dwelling units being replaced by, where a family of, 3 or 4 would probably stay, are now being replaced by thousands. And I would, on a personal level, I would love to see greater investment in non-motorized infrastructure. My father would cycle to town and come back, very safely, and we would just love that sort of element of, ditching, whether it's transportation, it's the way we're building, it's about sewage disposal, it's about health and hygiene, it's about civic discipline. And I think we are all sort of responsible as a collective, community. I think we're all sort of responsible for that. But yeah, there are also great instances of hope and a lot of, community development. There's been a lot of collaboration also between different agencies and stakeholders to see that this can be pushed out, and the awareness is there now. So I'm sort of very hopeful, but I would love to see more intervention in brownfield projects. It's very easy, to pick a low-hanging fruit and say, oh yeah, let's do that because it's not going to have any unrest, or there's going to be no opposition. But I'd like to see people get their hands dirty and make that small penetration. No one has a magic wand. You're not going to do it overnight. It might take 10 years, 15 years. It's a slow churning process, but I think this might sort of be one of the ways of actually creating penetration into greater civic responsibility as a collective.
We have time for just one tiny question. We have absolutely got to wrap up. But,
it's not really, it's not really a question. But I was really thinking about this idea of the apocalypse, and listening to what Vishal was saying about the death of architecture. And I remember Samira had done an exhibition a few years back called The Death of Architecture. And I was thinking about this, and while this was happening, I was thinking about, what Dar was talking about, the idea of storytelling and narratives. And that reminded me of people like Charles Correa and Shirish Patel, who recently died. And I was thinking about the way that they engaged with what they felt were the crises points of their time. And they engaged through storytelling. They were not engaging at a client kind of level. They were not engaging at a plot level. They were engaging with telling stories about what we needed to become and the kinds of spaces that we needed to do, and they did it right up till the end of their lives, right? So in some ways, I'm in agreement with everyone on stage. When Vishal is talking about the fact that we need to kind of be able to really think about a new form of architectural practice entirely. Or when Nuru is speaking about the fact that Lebbeus Woods' work, but Lebbeus Woods' work was emerging from a time of crisis, that the crisis in Sarajevo, his drawings are emerging from that time. I'm trying to say that we need to, as architects, be able to begin to tell new stories. Okay? New ways in which we can imagine things, but also be able to find the right people we need to communicate to. That was what Korea and Shirish Patel were doing. Right? We were not talking within these rooms to each other, but we were really talking to different kinds of communities entirely. So I feel like, especially the idea of practice in your triumvirate of words over there, fundamentally we need to rethink what architectural practice itself is and what the product of architecture is. And I think Korea and Shirish were both able to do that. And we live in a climate right now where that is no longer the case. We now think of architecture as that object that can be sold on the market. So I think somewhere we need to turn back and reclaim what the mandate of architecture is. That's it for me.
Any responses to that?
May I just add to what Rohan and Vishal had to say? Follow up on everything. Hi, I'm Neha, I understand Claire's question, and I understand the storytelling impulse to create a future, but I also want to go back to what Vishal started with at the very beginning, as the apocalypse is the past, and the world wars have set this up. So maybe what I want to link is, how does the abandonment of the Bombay streetscape, how does that have anything to do, and I think it does, but I want your thoughts on it, Vishal, on what you set up as the provocation, that World War II set us up for this present in some way. And if we take that all into account, that there's a story there that leads us to this point, then we might be able to get to another storyline that allows us to build anew. So.
Neha, don't put me on the spot. I'm provincial Dilliwala. Bombay is too difficult for me to respond to. But no, I was, Claire had a point. I kind of course, all of you, or all three of you are from Bombay. I've had a brush with Bombay last year. I'm sorry, I keep saying Bombay. I can't get out of it. Yeah, so I'm so sorry about that. The thing is that I don't mind the skyscrapers. One thing I want to bring back to what Rohan also just mentioned, I think that what connected architect, for me, for my generation at least, what connected architecture and cinema was spectacle. It was very important. I mean, movies were spectacles. Architecture was also a part of the spectacle. And what I kept going back to while everyone was speaking, especially Samira, about mentioning the pyramids, and they do connect to the city in some way, honestly, and Rohan might want to say something about it later, is about the Taj Mahal, making of the Taj Mahal. That there is an apocalypse created in the shape of a famine to make this cinematic moment happen in architecture. Which then embodies love, this and that. I think that making of the Taj, and I'm really, please don't kill me for it, making of the Taj and changing the landscape of what the river stood for is also something what changing of the street, would eventually stand for. That there is a correlation somewhere there. There is a spectacle that is happening, and let it happen. And if it's for capitalist needs, if it's for whatever greed, let it be greed. Let it happen, because we are not at all able to challenge the force for now. So we will just have to wait and see its impact. And that's also part of life. I mean, letting and allowing things to take.
Well,
no, I mean, but not to be, it's not that I don't think that architects don't have a place or that we don't need architects. But the reason why one started with Bernard's exhibition is because there is something there which is also diabolical. The architecture without architects, and what it kind of proposes in opposition to, let's say, what we are right now currently seeing, and sometimes not to take names of what that has done. It's a difficult space. I mean, and your question will have to be taken care of with another panel, because that's about
perhaps
the urban.
outside as well.
Yeah, okay, sorry, thank you.
Thank you for the provocation. I'm afraid this seems to be an elongated conversation, and there is space for it in the Pavilion Park, in all the other avenues that ADFF Stir offers you on its final day in its debut edition. But I did find some hope in this panel, and I hope you can take that hope again outside to experience the rest of the festival as well. All the conversations, I know that some of you are teaming with questions. I know that you are, Rohan, teaming up with stories. We'll have to take them outside. But thank you so much for being here for this panel. Some of the points here have been super interesting. I'm going to be pondering on them for a long time, and I hope you will be too. Thank you so much for being here.